Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so most of you guys in the audience here are from the city of Toronto, and as Kevin suggested, you already know how expensive it is to buy a home here. If you were looking to buy a home now, you're faced with an egregious cost of real estate, where $1 million in this city will get you something like this very tiny shack if you're lucky. If you're a renter in this city, you've probably had to aggressively lower your expectations while looking for apartments. Maybe you start out, you want 2 bedrooms, a nice view, and by the end of it, you're willing to settle for a windowless basement as long as you can pay under $1,500 a month. If you're someone in the city who needs to use social housing, you're facing 5 to 10-year wait lists just to even get an apartment. And in the meantime, the city's prime real estate is being eaten up by luxury condominium developments. So as we can see, affordable housing is an issue that affects people from all walks of life in Toronto, and it's actually an issue that faces people in major metropolitan cities around the world. So there have been a variety of different responses to this crisis, and today I want to talk about one very small effort that's coming out of the United States and quickly gaining popularity in Canada. So when I say small, I do literally mean small. I'm talking about, as Kevin suggested, the tiny housing movement. So the tiny housing movement describes itself as a social movement that's about living simply in a small home. And normally it's a home that you've actually built yourself. So if you guys have spent any amount of time on Instagram or Pinterest in the last 5 years, you've probably come across these sort of cutesy, hobbit-like interiors of tiny homes. And I will admit they are very aesthetically pleasing and very cute. But for all of its Instagrammable qualities, I don't actually think that the tiny housing movement presents a sustainable long-term solution to our problem of housing. And I'll explain why. So one thing you should know about the tiny living movement is that it presents itself as a very progressive and paradigm-shifting change. So the idea is you no longer have to mark the start of your adulthood by moving out, buying a home in the suburbs, and starting your family. You don't need a house with 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, more than 1 pair of shoes if you want to feel sustained and happy. But for all of this anti-consumerist language, I think the tiny housing movement actually thinks very conventionally about ownership. So we tend to think about ownership as an economic transaction. So it's about you as a buyer going into the marketplace to meet a seller, and your relationship is mediated by your purchasing power in the marketplace. How much money you have determines what you're going to be able to get. What we don't actually do is think about housing as a social right. And for me, this is an issue because access to housing actually mediates our access to so many other basic rights: running water, a safe place to store your objects, a safe place for your person, a place to rest, a comfortable temperature, and so on. So one thing I look at in my dissertation is the various ways we could think about the idea of a housing crisis. So it has a material component, it has an economic component, but I also think it has an imaginative component. We're overly invested, I think, in narratives of ownership that privilege individual autonomy that's determined by the marketplace, rather than thinking about housing as a social right or a social responsibility. In my mind, the tiny living movement only really offers an individualized and market-based solution to housing. And for me, that's a problem. So I'm going to explain to you why. Let's go back and talk a little bit more about tiny houses. So one of the reasons that the tiny living movement first caught my attention wasn't because it was new or different. In fact, it seemed to me very familiar and very old. So one of the writers I work on in my dissertation is Henry David Thoreau, on the screen up there, the original hipster for my 4 English people in the audience today. And Henry David Thoreau was a 19th century writer. He lived in Concord, Massachusetts, which is was at the time a popular urban area. And he moved out of Concord into the woods, like literally the woods, the forest, and he built himself a small cabin, which is pictured there, on the shore of Walden Pond, and he lived there for about 2 years. And that's just the frontispiece to Walden up there, the book that kind of details this experience. So on the other side here, we have Ryan Mitchell. And Ryan Mitchell is the founder of The Tiny Life, which is a company that now actually builds tiny homes. They also create a lot of cultural production around tiny houses. So they have a website, they have conferences, blogs, magazines, like all of the stuff you could possibly imagine. So there's a lot of interesting similarities, I think, between Mitchell and Ryan. For the first part, they begin their process of sort of thinking about living small during times of economic crisis. So Mitchell starts this company for living small in about 2008, when the housing crisis is really sinking its teeth into the marketplace. And for both Thoreau and Mitchell, the idea of economic self-determination is absolutely crucial to their idea of freedom, right? You need to be able to own something free and clear. Doesn't matter how small it is, but you have to have it. In general, the idea of affordability is crucial to thinking about tiny living. It's one of its central tenets. So this is an image I pulled off of the website of one of the various tiny living web pages, and it's kind of an inspo framing that you will frequently see when you visit these websites, go to their conferences, go down the rabbit hole as I have done. You weren't born to pay bills and die. You weren't born to pay off debt and die. I mean, I agree with this sentiment, of course, and I'm sure many of us in the audience also do as well. If you don't, I mean, like, wait for me outside. I'll explain to you why you should. But for the most part, right, for all the talk of, economic freedom, we need to ask, how affordable is a tiny house, really? So if you were to actually go and build a tiny house yourself, you're looking at about $27,000 to $37,000. If you had to get someone to build your tiny house for you, the cost could be upwards of $80,000. And that's assuming, I guess how Instagrammable you want the interior to be. But still, $30,000, $80,000, these price points made me ask, who is the imagined consumer of a tiny home? When I think about it, to me, it seems like it's being geared towards a middle-class person. You have $30,000 in savings or access to credit, and you're going to either put it down towards a down payment on a home, or you're going to buy a tiny house free and clear. But what do we do about people who don't have access to this kind of credit or these kinds of savings? Not to mention that if you were to build your tiny home yourself, you need about 9 to 12 months of full-time building this tiny house to be able to even accomplish the project. So it's also imagining a person who can take this much time off of work. In my mind, this is a very middle-class solution to an issue, which is not necessarily a problem, but what do we do with vulnerable communities? What do we do with people who can't imagine saving this amount of money for living, or within a reasonable time frame? To me, I think the tiny living movement presents a somewhat limited and narrow response to our idea of housing. It's not affordable enough to be a universal solution. So you might be thinking, well, tiny living can't solve everybody's problems, so what? Or you might be thinking, well, we live in a capitalist society. We live in a market-based society. Everything's a commodity. I mean, right? So what? So this is where I think a humanities or English approach might be useful for us in thinking about the problem of housing. So I'm about to hit you guys with some classical political philosophy right now, so don't fall asleep, don't check out. It's very important. Stay with me, okay? So one of the key ideas governing our liberal democratic society, which is the kind of society that we live in now, is the idea of Justin Trudeau. Is the idea of the social contract. So the social contract is essentially an arrangement between us as citizens and you and the state, where we basically say, okay, we as citizens agree to abide by the government's laws in exchange for protection of our persons and our property right. So what this means, it's not necessarily an explicit arrangement. You won't sit down with Justin Trudeau and say, okay, I'll obey your rules if nobody steals my car. He'd be down for it, but that's not actually what is going to happen. It's more of an implicit assumption that governs how we organize our civic life. So the idea of protection here, right, the state's going to protect you, is very important. How this has been interpreted depends on your context, but in North America, this usually means that you already own something, maybe it's a house or a car, and you have access to the state's monopoly on violence or force to protect it. So someone takes your stuff, you can go to the police, you can go to the law, and they can try and redress this issue. That might sound like a perfectly fair arrangement, and in some ways it actually is. However, what we saw during the housing crisis in the United States, I think, was a total breakdown of this arrangement. So we saw tens of thousands of people lose their homes, lose their investments, go underwater on their mortgages, and nothing was done really on the part of the state to redress this. We did see the state offer huge bailouts for banks, for investors, for private capital. So the state and the market, their interests, I guess we could say, were simpatico in this moment. But everybody else, their relationship in the social contract kind of got pushed off to the side a little bit. In my mind, this amounts to a total breakdown of the promise of the social contract. And I think that people who are interested in tiny living would actually agree with me. They would say, yes, the social contract is in jeopardy. We can't trust the state to protect our interests. Their solution, however, remains an economically oriented one. Let's still go into the market, find a solution that's affordable for just you, and then leave the state out of it. That might seem appealing in some ways, but I think this arrangement, which tries to remove the state's interest from you and the marketplace, is what got us into this mess in the first place. So now you might be thinking, okay, so what can we offer in its stead? What could we do instead of thinking about housing solely as a commodity or only as a commodity logic? So one thing I've been suggesting throughout this presentation is that we could think about housing as a social right. Now, I'm an English PhD student, but I'm definitely not naive. I know that a transformation like this would not happen overnight, right? Real estate is unbelievably lucrative. There's a lot of money to be made from it. And an investor or a banker, they're not just gonna say, well, housing was a right, we didn't know, houses for all, right? That's not actually gonna happen. So, nonetheless, though, I do actually think that there are some immediate practical implementations that we could do by using this idea of thinking of housing as a right. And it could take many different forms. It could take the form of earmarking funds for housing as part of a basic income program. And as you guys know, that's something the province of Ontario is actually thinking about right now. It could look like new municipal zoning laws that place housing in proximity to affordable amenities like grocery stores or good schools, libraries, whatever. It could look like subsidies for people who live in densely populated urban areas. My list of ideas could go on, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of really good ideas too about how we could address the issue of housing in a way that's fair and equitable. But I don't think we can even begin to have this conversation unless we have a robust, rights-based language to talk about housing. So some last thoughts that I'm going to leave you with before we go off and eat snacks together. So if you were someone who lives in a tiny house already, or you were thinking of buying a tiny house, yes, you should do it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with wanting to live in a tiny home. I think it's just as valid a personal choice as living in a regular house or renting an apartment. But just like renting an apartment is not a socially transformative act, purchasing a tiny home is also not sufficient to solve our crisis of housing. As I've suggested in this presentation, I think we need to think socially, structurally, and politically about the problem of housing. We need to think bigger than tiny homes. Thank you.